Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Ohio Education Technology Conference. We've got a special guest here from Huntsville, Alabama, Superintendent of the Year. We want to thank Pearson for sponsoring our speaker, Colonel Casey Wardinski. Like I said, he was the Superintendent of the Year last year, Tech-Savvy Superintendent of the Year last year. He's going to help. He's going to give you his take on what he did to take a district from 0 to 100 miles an hour in a hurry. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. On a housekeeping note, obviously the weather has played havoc for this city and the state pretty much. And I would advise each of you to check the mobile app for our sessions. We've had some cancellations. And then also stop over at the Info Ohio reference desk. And there's a print in the main concourse, and there's a printed addendum as well. So please double check that your sessions are still going forward. And also check the mobile app as well. So without further ado, let's get our speaker out here, Colonel Casey Wardinski.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good morning, everybody. I'm actually not a colonel anymore. I'm retired. I retired about 3 years ago from the Army. I was teaching at West Point, and I was the Army's chief economist, which is a little bit like being an economist in a communist country. But I'm now a superintendent. I came into Huntsville by way of the Broad Superintendent's Academy, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning. And what I'd like to do for about the next 50 minutes or so is share with you our journey going from paper to the world of digital learning. Huntsville is in northern Alabama. We're home of the Army Missiles and Space Program and the Marshall Space Flight Center. So the folks that took us to the moon and now run Skylab and the next project to take us into deep space exploration, those folks are in Huntsville, Alabama. So by way of a roadmap, I thought I'd provide you sort of a context for why we undertook a digital conversion from paper to the world of digital learning. Then I thought I'd give you an idea of what our goals were, why we did this, and that would be important in any journey. You're going to need to be able to articulate to your board, to your community, why are we making this big change? Because as you know, in education, change isn't too easy. Then, what was our approach? How did we go about doing it? How quick did we do it? What did we do? Some of the cost figures, because a lot of times money comes up. Can we afford this? How did you afford this? And then finally, the results we're seeing. So, probably not a big surprise to folks that attend a conference like this, but maybe a little bit of a surprise to folks back home. One of the biggest problems with education is everybody went to school. And so they all know what right looks like because it worked out for them. But what was right perhaps 10, 20, 50 years ago is likely not necessarily be the perfect solution for today. And one of the things that undergirds my entire presentation is the idea that we live in different times. And different times require different solutions. And one of the key differences today is we live in exponential times. When you look around at change in our world, it's not unfolding in a predictable fashion. It's unfolding in a way that's accelerating all the time. A way of thinking about that is, if you were to graph the number of patents granted in the United States each year, going all the way back to just before the Civil War, you'd see that over the initial period up to about 1980, things unfolded in a fairly linear fashion. And that meant things were really predictable. Tomorrow looked a little bit like today, and yesterday looked a lot like today. And so things were predictable. But about 1980, the world began to change. That change upended the Soviet Empire. The microchip spelled their doom. They simply couldn't keep up. It's also upended the world of business. When you think about businesses, the safe move in the old days was have some Kodak stock in your nest egg. Anybody have Kodak? Anybody bought any film lately? Right? Not so much. You could tell a child in a school, run down the hall to the Xerox machine, and they'd know what you meant. Both companies are shadows of their former selves, thanks to the microprocessor and exponential change. And so that red line depicts the new trend. Things are really unfolding quickly, and they're unfolding in very disruptive ways for business, for governments, and now for education. And for us, probably because other things are knocking on our doorsteps. Charter schools, private schools, virtual schools that are meaning even if we didn't want to change, we don't have a choice anymore. As a government sort of monopoly on education, we had the choice not to innovate for a long, long time. That choice really isn't there anymore. Technology, for those of us in the room, has redefined the way we live, work, and play. They're all mingled together now. Often when I'm playing, I'm also working. I've got my iPhone and I'm checking a text or a voicemail coming in. When I'm at home, I start my day by doing email so I can spend the days in the schools. Couldn't have done that in the old way. I would have had to be in the office a certain amount of time just to catch up on paperwork. So our lives have changed, but when you think of children, theirs haven't quite changed just yet. When we go home, our workday continues into our home life, our play day. When they go home, unless they're doing their homework, it's over. And certainly when school's out in the summer or during breaks, it's over. Wouldn't it be great if we could find a way to make our resources, our educational efforts, interesting enough for them to take their time and spend it working on things that are going to improve their education? And I think that time has arrived when we can begin doing that. Two things really changed the world around us, and they're now changing education. One was a fellow you probably are well familiar with since you're at this conference, a fellow named Moore, and he took note of a regularity in the world of microprocessors. Things tend to double, twice the speed, twice the power, half the size, half the cost. That happens every year, or it happens all the time in technology. That made possible the world of having a computer in your pocket, your iPhone, all the resources we carry around, an iPad. Well, the other thing that happened was a fellow named Metcalf over at AT&T took notice of another phenomenon. What happens when you put people in a network? And the networks they were looking at were governmental networks at that time for the Defense Department, but today they found their way into our iPhones and things like MySpace, Facebook, LinkedIn, Edmodo, and so forth. And the regularity there is, as you add more people to that network, it gets more and more powerful. Well, putting these two ideas together, think what that means for education. What if we had the technology that we could connect our kids to a network of learning, and they could always be learning, and then that network would get more powerful over time? That Huntsville City Schools would be in a network with Columbus, Ohio, and LA, and Albany, and every improvement to the educational resources in that network made in any one of those nodes would instantly feed through to kids across the network. That would radically change the way we approach providing learning resources to our kids. Well, that's gone on around us. That's gone on in industry. When you look at the way firms work today, they work much differently than they did the old days. They work virtually, conference calls, come together around a project, collaborate around the world and around the clock. And that's driven by technological change. So if you think back to the world of Cortez, two little technologies, the compass and the boat, changed the world. The compass and the boat brought the Spaniards to this continent, and when those folks arrived on this continent, the days of two great civilizations were numbered, the Incas and the Aztecs. That was that far back in history. Now think of what could happen today with radical change when technology comes into play, some disruptive technology. It changes society. Society has been reacting to that. We've seen the world of collaboration change dramatically due to a tool created by a guy at Harvard that just wanted to date, Facebook. That's changed the way our kids interact. It's changed discipline in schools. Problems in our schools now roll in through Facebook. Comments about our schools shape the image of our schools through Facebook. That's a radical change. Business. Business is changing just a little bit slower than society, but it's changing pretty rapidly as well. So the business of education, you see fewer and fewer textbooks coming your way from companies like McGraw-Hill, Pearson, and so forth, and a lot more digital solutions. And then finally, political change. That's our world. A world of public education is really a political subdivision of something, the state, the county, or the city. And we tend to unfold relatively slowly. And around us are things like charter schools, private schools, virtual schools, parochial schools, home schools, and they're adapting really quite quickly. So if we were just to pick one of the 12 technologies that are identified as going to shape the world in the next 10 years, and think about how that would fall back into education. 3D printing. Out in the outer room here, I saw a MakerBot, a 3D printer for about $15,000. That device, if you scale it up, looks like that device. And that lady standing in front of a printer, and on the printing table there, she has printed a turbine wheel with turbine blades on it for a jet aircraft. So if you're in the world of FedEx or UPS, probably a high profit margin item would be to do just-in-time logistics. Delta Airline might have a jet in LA. It needs a new turbine blade and a jet engine to be ready for tomorrow morning. You don't have those parts on hand. You get a hold of FedEx, they ship one to you for several $1,000s overnight, and away you go. Well, what about Delta just sends you the electronic file, you send it over to Kinko's, and you print the parts you need. Just think what that'll do to industries, and what that'll do to our kids. Because if we're training them and preparing them just for specific skills, they're going to be in trouble. And so how do we prepare them for the world that's probably on our doorstep? Well, the old reality of doing that really unfolded World War I and World War II. The country responded to those crises with a new approach to education, which was very industrial in nature. If you looked at it, it was based on some underlying premises, one of which was the resource base. We drove resources from people's income and people's property and people's consumption patterns. So those three things drove spending habits in education, which were basically driven by an idea that GDP always goes up. Well, if GDP always goes up, gross domestic product, so does income, which means income taxes goes up. That means we've got a rising source of revenue for school systems. Property values always went up until about 5 years ago, and then they didn't. But as property values went up, a lot of school systems were paid for with property tax, and so that was a rising source of income for school systems. And then sales taxes, and they were derivative of income and consumption. So rising period, almost from World War II to 2009, with some irregularities in it, but constantly rising sources of revenue for public education. That meant as requirements on education increased, and we went from simply educate my child to raise my child, feed my child, take care of my child, transport my child, and all the other things we have to do, there were resources to do it. And we attacked the problem with things like class size, remediation, interventions, and so forth, which usually meant more labor. Well, the focus was on what's and those sorts of things, facts. Well, in a world of exponential growth and knowledge and learning, facts are going to be really hard to keep track of, and there's really little point. We've got Google, we've got resources to do that. There may be other things we need to worry about today. And of course, the structure that evolved was very centralized. In fact, most school systems' headquarters is called a central office, and that tells you almost everything you need to know. And then with regard to learning systems, things were very discrete. Kids moved along an assembly line in penny packets of time, gaining information in penny packets of content areas. So we went and added kindergarten. That took us up to 13 years at 180 days, typically at 6.8 hours a day, maybe 7, and that was education. Then we added pre-K, and in some places we've added 3-year-old programs, but very discrete. And children would learn as the average child should learn, in a very predictable pattern. Well, the world we live in today has some real new realities. And a lot of these changes we see are really being driven by finances. We know we have to do more. We know our kids are going to live in an exponential age, and yet the resources are very tight. Some states are still seeing cuts. Most are seeing flat resources. Some are seeing marginally growing, but not growing at the rate that one would need to go about business the old ways, add more labor. So information and conceptual area, my school system sees a flat tax base. We're down $1,200 per student since 2009. And that has not increased. We haven't seen any real increases. No money for technology, no money for textbooks. You name it, no more money. And yet, on comes the Common Core. On comes more rigorous standards and the expectation that our children will succeed. The focus has moved from the what's and the who's to the why's and the how. How would a 3D printer change my business? Why would we want to regulate that industry? If we were, how would we regulate that industry? All sorts of questions are going to come up from these new technologies that our children are going to have to grapple with. The structure, far less centralized. We have far less control over education in our communities. I'm superintendent in Huntsville, Alabama. Notionally, I'm responsible for all education, private, parochial, and so forth in my city, but really very little control over it. And then finally, learning. From discrete, really we're headed towards continuous. Wouldn't it be great if our kids were always learning? Wherever they were, they had the resources and the ability to always have at hand tools that if they had a question or the interest, they could continue their learning. So given those new realities that we think we face in Huntsville, we've got a new way of going about business. So in 2011, we were an entirely paper-based school system. The kind of Wi-Fi we had in our 42, at that time 46 schools, was whatever mom and dad had bought through the PTA and brought in from Best Buy, little bitty routers and so forth. If there was a computer in use, it was usually in a lab. It was usually some sort of a pull-out situation, or it was at the back of the classroom. But technology was accoutrement. It was not the central feature of education. And when the students left the school, if there was technology, it stayed behind. Now, our school system is about 54% free and reduced. And so that means some things too. If the technology stays at school, probably creating, over time, if we do use technology, a digital divide. The children with resources will probably have a computer in their home, will probably have access to online resources, but the children without will be without. And that creates a significant problem in any school district worried about equitable education. So, at the same time, we were contemplating introduction of the Common Core standards in Alabama. We call them college and career standards because of political issues, but they're very much the same standards you're looking at in Ohio. Well, that invites a new approach. We're going to bring about new standards. It's going to require new ways of doing business. We know that. Instruction's going to have to change. Why not do the digital conversion at the same time? Instead, one major conversion followed by another. So that was the approach we took. And we looked at what it would take to do that and quickly decided we needed some pretty sophisticated partners. Now, our reasons for doing that were, as here I'm sure, preparation for college and career. To make sure our kids were in position that when they left our school system, they were ready to succeed at college or go off and have a meaningful career. And ideally, be in a position to be a lifelong learner. While we were doing that, nipping at our heels were charter schools, homeschools, private schools, and so forth. And the real differentiating factor that we thought would exist that would give us an advantage as we went digital was scale. A large school system has tremendous advantages in the digital world when it comes to scale. The devices we purchased, the relationships we created, because of our scale, were very strong. So, for example, we brought in 20,000 Hewlett-Packard laptop computers for our students. I want to say, if you were to look at the website price, they're about $1,200. And because of our size, we paid about $700 for them. Those are the kind of advantages you can have in public education that may not occur in other domains. Learning systems, we really wanted not only to have our children always learning, but to be able to work with partners in our community too. So churches, YMCA, and so forth. When we're not in session, we'd like to be able to develop over time personalized learning plans and have the child have the online resources they needed so when they went to a provider outside the public school system, they could continue to advance their learning. So these are some statistics about our system. We're fairly large. We're in the top 100 school systems in the United States. Fairly dynamic. Probably the widest achievement gap in the country. Our lows are very low and our highs are really high. And it sort of matches our concern about the provision of digital resources as well. So we began to reorganize education, thinking we were entering a new era. As we did that, we wanted to do some other things. We wanted to create the ability to have growth models. We wanted to move away from achievement-focused standards for our teachers. We knew we were going to learn things about our classrooms that we had never known before, because with digital education, you can see into every classroom. You can see how much homework's being done, what problems were solved, which ones weren't, what kind of systemic gaps there are in the school system with regard to standards that would drive PD. We knew we would begin seeing all that, and we wanted to be on a field where we could be fair to our teachers. So as we moved students into classes where perhaps the student was 3 and 4 grade levels behind, clearly even the most heroic effort would only advance that student 2 or 3 years in a year, and the student would still be behind, and achievement models wouldn't give the credit where credit was due to those teachers. So growth became our focus, and growth against external standards. We quickly learned that our report cards meant almost nothing, that every school gave Bs, and yet at some schools giving Bs, the students were operating in the 85th, 95th percentile nationally, and at other schools they were operating at the 17th percentile nationally. And so the external standards were critical to us, and the ability to benchmark against those continually. So we didn't wait for the end of the year to sort of do an autopsy. We were able to be involved directly in a way that we can intervene and have an impact during the current year. Computer adaptive formative assessment. We didn't want to add to the grading burden for our teachers, and we wanted our kids to get immediate feedback that we know is so important. So the digital resources really helped in this regard. A lot more on-the-fly assessment so that we could react and change instruction, and yet not a lot more work for the teachers. The teachers really became more of doctors receiving lab reports and a lot less of lab techs just doing blood tests. And then finally, we wanted our students to be in a ubiquitous learning environment, always with resources in hand, always networked, always able to collaborate. And these are the attributes we were looking for. In order to be in contact with our kids when they're not in contact with us, they had to be in a network. That meant certain things about how our schools had to look, about the partnerships we had to form with the community and the city to create networked opportunities in McDonald's, various business establishments, public housing authority, housing environments, city parks, and so forth. We wanted our work to be collaborative. We wanted the kids to be able to interact with their teachers at home, at Moto, and those sorts of resources. The interactive component was vital, that if a student got stuck doing their algebra homework at home, there'd be tools at hand where they could get unstuck. Because typically, as you get into high school, mom and dad just aren't as helpful as they used to be in elementary school. Personalized, obviously, we want to go in this route, and as we became digital, this became more and more tractable. Last year, we had a 5th grade student that, based on our curriculum, we were able to move in 9th grade. He's now virtually working in 9th grade a good bit of the time, and only physically is in the company of older students part of the day and in pretty well supervised environments. Engaging, if we're going to get the students to do this on their time, the material definitely has to be engaging. It can't be dry, boring stuff written as we did in the day of textbooks. And then finally, always available. So in approaching this, we could have come at it from the top, and very often these sorts of efforts are called one-to-ones. And I really think that's a misnomer. If it's about the computer, one ought to go back to the beginning and say, why do we want to give a child a computer? Why do we want to provide them these resources? Because teachers, by and large, aren't going to be creators of curriculum. Teachers are very much like doctors in my mind. They don't make medicine, they prescribe it. Teachers prescribe the right curriculum, work with the right child to bring about the right results. And so instead of starting at the top and saying we're going to give hardware out, we started at the bottom. And we started with what did we want to achieve, and I've given you some indications of that. We wanted homework and that time at home to be used effectively. We wanted more of it. We wanted to get the kids unstuck when they were giving us their time. We wanted to know how it went. So my teachers didn't have to do all that sampling that goes on in class to figure out where Johnny and Sally are. Typically in a class, you'll see about 5 minutes of sampling happening. That sampling is helping the teachers decide which groups am I going to put these children in. Who's on task, who's a little behind, who's ahead. Well, why not do that based on information you gathered from the night before? And when you can see their homework, who did well, who got stuck, the teacher can immediately do grouping strategies so they roll right into instruction. And that 5 minutes becomes productive time. 5 minutes over 13 years is actually a year of instruction we gain back, simply by gaining those insights. When the children are doing their homework, let's have it all graded before they come to school. Let's have them know how they did. Let's not take teacher time doing lab tests. Their time's too valuable. So even though I can't give them a lot more pay, I can give them better quality of life by moving all that scut work off their plate, giving them access to tools to make their work more rewarding and avoid a lot of that grading. That's particularly important with written work. In our school system, I'm sure yours are different, I didn't see any 20-page papers in high school. I was doing well to see 2-page papers. Didn't see a lot of drafts. They used a formula we used to use at West Point. RD equals FC. Rough draft equals final copy. That usually doesn't lead to the best written work, and certainly doesn't provide students the kind of feedback they need to improve their writing. Well, with the tools we have now, Write to Learn and so forth, students can be given a writing assignment that's related to their reading work, their social studies, their science, and they can iterate back and forth, and the teacher can watch their work evolve and just grade the last draft, which leads to more writing and better writing. So those were some of the things we wanted from homework. The other things we wanted to do was, as we moved to the Common Core, we knew that was going to be a tough change. And anybody that's ever been to high school, we call those our carnivores in Huntsville, knows the culture there is much different than down in elementary where the vegans reside. Getting elementary changed is not that tough. Getting high school changed is really tough. And it's really tough for a bunch of reasons, one of which is the principal may have taught science, walks into a history class and sees George Washington and Martin Luther King on the wall and figures it's all good. Or he might have taught history and walks into a calculus class and sees something he still doesn't understand and figures that's good. And it's very difficult to change the direction of instruction here. Well, as we went into the Common Core, we know the standards are going to ramp up. We knew our students had already been exhibiting performance we weren't terrifically proud of on things like quality core assessments. And we were going to want to help our teachers understand the gap between where they were pitching things and what was supposed to be pitched and how the students were doing. And having data would be pretty handy to do that. So those sorts of things really drove our desire for the first phase, and then ultimately the personalization that would follow, so we can actually begin approaching our students from a point of interest and from where they were in the curriculum. To do that was pretty complex. This effort involved every aspect of our district, from logistics to finance, to instruction to special needs, all the way to the daily involvement of the superintendent. That meant we needed project management. We didn't want to go this alone, so we brought in Pearson as our partner. We are not their customer, as near as I can tell, because as we do well, they do well, and if we stumble, they stumble. These are big undertakings. These are new times for this sort of work, and so everybody's looking at how these initiatives are going. So having a good project manager on board was vital to us. They helped us get past finger pointing to solutions very readily, because there's not a lot of time for finger pointing, obviously, when you've got kids in a networked environment and the network's not working right. The next step, the infrastructure. You don't want to go into such an undertaking without a pretty robust infrastructure. So we tried to partner with the best there as well. So Cisco, various providers. I saw Dino in the outer hall here. Dino is a great partner with us. They help teachers monitoring what's going on in the computers in the classroom, allow teachers to slide their work onto kids' desktops. Lightspeed, they help filter at the school system level. And I would say in our first 2 weeks of being a digital district, we blew through our filters, we blew through the state filters, and we started looking for solutions quick. Our children are very bright, and I'm sure yours are too. We teach cybersecurity, which is kind of hacking in our school system, and our kids got through that stuff quick. I'll show you what that looks like. So monitoring tools come into question, having good ones. Wi-Fi on school buses. Part of this question of how do kids do their homework at home if they don't have connectivity? Well, some of them have pretty long bus routes, so they can do it on the bus home, and that's all E-ratable. And then increased bandwidth, which I'll show you in a moment. And finally, the devices. And the device selection was driven by what sort of assessments are we going to deliver. We don't want the kids scrolling all over the screen trying to find the question and the answer. What's a good screen aspect ratio for looking at this stuff at home? What's a good battery life? We don't want to be charging computers in school and so forth. And what device, most importantly, when you have 20,000 of them, can we actually manage remotely? Good device management. So our kids are pretty clever. This is one of the tools we use. These folks I saw out in the outer hall too. Absolute Software and CompuTrace. Questions we got when we got going. Are you really going to give a laptop that costs $1,200 to a third grader? Yes. Well, they're going to lose it. Well, perhaps, but there's things you can do about that. This is a picture of where my computers were on the day that we took this picture. And a couple were in San Francisco, a couple in LA, Miami, and upstate New York. But what this is really a picture of is pretty bright kids. The computers are actually in Huntsville, but they're using a software product made in China called Siphon that allows them to connect to proxy servers and get around my filters. Now, the Chinese want the real information, and all their information's filtered, so they've made really good ways around filters, and my kids have found them. So we don't take that as a problem. We just look at it as another opportunity to get those kids involved in helping us with our digital initiative. And then we run tools to help spot this, and this indicates which kids are using these tools, and then we can go talk to them. It helps with our network planning for away from school. To the left is a high school where all the dots are. And to the right of that is a public housing area, and this is a picture taken when we should have had some kids on the internet at night, and there's no kids showing up in that housing area, which tells us they've got a connectivity problem. So with this kind of information, we approach the Public Housing Authority, and they're splitting the Comcast cost with us, so the kids can have access at home. In terms of damage, these kids are going to lose their computers. It's not important to read every bar there, it's just kind of important to look at the trend. The elementaries are on the left, the middles are in the middle, and the highs are on the right, and that's the repair rate either for warranty or accidental damage in the first year, for the second year of use. The red bars were the first year of use. And so there's a learning curve for the kids. How do I take care of a computer? Those concerns about what happens if the computers break, those are all real concerns. So as you go into this, logistics become very important. How do I maintain 20,000 devices that go home every night, who mommy's boyfriend may be using for God knows what, instead of the student? So you can see our repair rate in the first year, and it was very high in middle school, which confirms something we know. Middle schoolers' brains don't work right. And by the second year, it was way down. In fact, it was down around the same as everybody else. And the interesting thing was, elementary was really sort of always the lowest. So the little kids are not the ones you have to worry about. It's the middle schoolers and maybe the high schoolers. But just like anything in a school system, if you put the right protocols in place, the right incentives in place, the kids do respond. Bandwidth, before we got going, our bandwidth was there in yellow, and it was almost nothing. That was the usage coming in through our labs, and every school had lab computers. We had about 8,000 desktop computers of various ages. And the day we turned it on, the green was where we were. And it's gone up from there. And this is just something we buy like electricity. And we use two vendors. We use the state resources. We have a supercomputer authority in Alabama. We buy from them. And we also buy from private providers to keep the state honest. Quick service is not something that's normal to government. And if your internet problems are ongoing, you know, we'll get around to it after the national holiday. Probably aren't good answers. So a lot of resources involved and a lot of partnerships. And they really are partnerships much more than just being a customer. Each of those entities I've mentioned, Dyno, Pearson, Lightspeed, HP, is with us every step of the way. And we have people we can call that are very, very responsive. And so the money, what does this end up looking like financially? So remember, our approach was 20,000 laptops. If you were to try and buy these off the internet, the list price, I think, is about $1,200, and then about 6,000 iPads. The iPads are in pre-K through second grade. The ratios are 1-to-1 in second grade, 1-to-1 in first grade, 1-to-2 in pre-K, or kindergarten, and 1-to-5 in pre-K. And then the laptops are 1-to-1. Those go home and back to school. So, devices. You can see what we're paying for the devices. We lease them. We don't think they're going to be much good after 3 years, so we're not looking to keep them. We have a maintenance contract that takes care of accidental damage and warranty costs, repair. Excellent vendor doing this for us, RTI. We never have a problem. So they run them to the schools, bring them back, fix them on site. It's about a 5-day turnaround to fix a device. I've seen things done to devices I couldn't believe. One kid took one into a shower, another one set his on fire. But what did they do to textbooks, right? They didn't treat those particularly well either, right? So, summer refresh. We re-image and clean up our computers every summer. So we spend about $7 doing that. They all get shipped off to South Dakota. Digital curriculum cost. This is where the real differences start jumping out. So think of what textbooks cost. For our district to re-equip our students with textbook would have been somewhere around a $20 million effort. And we never would have done it. And we've just done what we normally did, which is when they're finally totally torn up, we do an adoption. We'll do math, we'll do science, and so forth. Every year, our curriculum is brand new. Our kids just subscribe, like you might subscribe to an online magazine or some other online resource. And it's based on so many dollars for each curriculum element. So we use Envision Math, and I think that costs us about $15 a student per each year. It gets a little more expensive as you go into high school. In elementary, we have 5 elements, when you think of them: reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. Middle school, we have about 15. In high school, we have about 60. Some of our high schools are teaching 23 AP courses, and there's materials for them. They work in the same learning environment. So one of the things that was important to us and why we went with one entity, Pearson, in selecting our curriculum to get going was we didn't want to have people flopping around between different learning management systems, different instructional management systems, different look and feel, different PD, and so forth. It would already be hard enough. And so we've had a very consistent approach. Once you understand one component, you understand them all, much as in the world of Windows. Professional development. We knew we couldn't convert ourselves, so we brought in professional development. In this case, it was from Pearson as well. It was their content, their development team. And so we have 30 days in every school every year for the first 2 years, and then it goes 15 days, 7 days, 3 days, and then we'll evaluate from there. And then networking costs, we spend about $200 per student to bring in our network. That's a one-time cost. Well, we saw positive results almost from the day we turned it on. The first results we saw, we didn't expect. They came to us from principals, and they had to do with discipline. So our discipline rates across every grade level and across the school system went down by about a third. And the principals came in and said, Dr. Wardinski, something's happened. That's never good news when you're superintendent, because something is never good. This something was good. The children are so much better behaved this year. I'm like, really? Well, what do you attribute that to? Well, they're pretty engaged in their learning now. They're pretty engaged in class. And they're not acting out and acting up. And so we started looking, and there it was. When we looked at reportable infractions and the like, we saw it. And when we looked at suspensions, we saw it. So the first 3 sets of bars were before we got going, and the last set is the first year of being a digital school system. Big changes. And of course, when you have those kind of improvements in discipline, you can also see improvements in learning, because they're kind of the opposite sides of the same coin. So we're down 29% in suspensions in school, 27% out of school. On buses, our discipline rate went down by 3/4, which is huge. And the bus was actually a wonderful experiment. Same bus driver, same kids, same route. The only delta, the only change was it a Wi-Fi bus or not? And of course, one year they weren't, and the next year they were. And when you get to do this sort of stuff, of course, you get to help a lot of help from a lot of people. And my bus drivers volunteered. Yeah, but they're not all doing their homework. Some are playing games. I'm like, they're not getting in trouble, right? And most of the games they're playing are like cool math. That's okay. So the other results we began to seeing, we used Renaissance Learning to do some of our formative assessments in reading and math. And we were looking to see what kind of gains we'd get here. And so orange was before digital, blue is after in the first year. And we started seeing really good gains as we looked at math in our high schools, reading in our high schools, the middles, reading in the middle, and our elementaries, math and reading. And so not only do we have the way to get these sorts of results in real time rather than having to wait for them, so the students saw their results immediately. They were able to take the assessments very quickly, so our average assessment time went down to about 15 minutes, so we could do it more frequently. Folks had the results they needed to tailor instruction, and we begin to seeing results elsewhere. The way we're getting to our next set of results is really through that other part we were talking about, the conversion to the Common Core and using data and the resources from the digital curriculum to help drive that. So within our system, we use an instructional management system called SchoolNet. And in SchoolNet, our teachers are actually drawn from the NWEA Test Bank, Pearson Test Bank, and other test banks. So we bring in our most effective teachers, who we now know who they are. They draw questions into our test bank. They weight the number of questions. They align them with our pacing guides, which are aligned with the year goal for standards, which are aligned with things like ACT Common Core, Quality Core, and ACT College Readiness exams. And they build the tests. And our kids take those online. To guard against, as you succeed, you know, one of the things that always comes up is they're cheating. Well, this helps us guard against that too, because the children will all see the same questions during an assessment period, but they'll all see them in different orders. So it'll be very difficult to intervene in that process and guide a test. The teachers themselves don't see the assessments until the moment the children do. That leads to some novel insights from teachers. At probably one of our strongest performing high schools, teachers were telling kids, we don't know what to tell you to study for because we haven't seen the test. Right? That tells you everything you need to know, right? You shouldn't have to see the test. You should be studying against the standards, which are well known and published at the beginning of the year. They're part of the Common Core. But our teachers hadn't been used to teaching against standards. They had their nicely laminated lesson plans that they'd been using these many years, some of them, and they were working off of those still. And so as parents would call and say, what are we doing? This digital, you know, my God, my kids don't know what to study for. I'm like, well, let's see, there's standards, just like there's standards for a superintendent. If there's a fire in a school on Monday, which I don't know there's going to be, the standard is get the kids out, get the fire department in, keep the kids warm, let mom and dad know, and come up with a plan B for instruction. That's the standard. I don't know if there's a fire on Monday, but I'm ready. Your children don't know if they're going to be using a 3D printer or what kind of work they're going to be doing, but we know the standard and what they need to know. And so as we went into that to guide instruction, we conduct a conference call every quarter with all of our principals at grade level, so elementary, middle, and high, and we review their data. So this is ongoing tomorrow. This is the data we're going to be looking at. This is one of my strongest, the next page is one of my strongest elementary schools, and we're working off these 5th grade ELL standards. And the ones in yellows are ones we're not doing really well at as a school system. And you can see how many questions are administered on every standard. It gives you an idea how important we thought they were. And this is a grid of Blossomwood Elementary, probably one of my top elementary schools, a Blue Ribbon school. And you can see the standards in the columns. And on the horizontals, you've got teacher 1 through 4. Those are the actual teachers in that school. Top line, you can see the district. So first, overall, in English Language Arts, about 70% of the points were earned by our students in English Language Arts across the school system on Common Core standards. Blossomwood got about 79% of those points. And then within that school, you can see the teachers, and they were all pretty tightly clustered. You go over to the 3rd standard there, LA5, L39C. The school system, about 78% of the points earned. We have a teacher in that school, her students got 100% of the points. And in the same grade level, there was a teacher whose students got 79%. The principal should now have a collaboration strategy. Teacher number 4 and teacher number 1 need to work together. And they can solve any PD problems they've got right there at the grade level. At the school system level, over in the last standard, LA5, R110, the school system's fairly weak. The school's better than the school system, but the school system's still fairly weak. Okay, we have a PD problem school system-wide. We now know we need to do something about it. We had none of that information 2 years ago, at least not in real time. We might have it a year or 18 months later, but by then, what are we going to do with it? The other thing that's going on is, so these are our benchmark assessment results in our high schools. And high schools are very tough, as you know, to convert to anything. And the benchmark scores are the ones that our teachers built that are administered through that SchoolNet system. These are the NWEA test bank questions that are aligned with ACT Common Quality Core, and Common Core. And you can see there's quite a spread there in terms of student performance. This is the average percents awarded to students in the same course during the semester. And this is the average semester exam grade. So Grissom High School on the far right, it's one of the top 100 high schools in the United States. The teachers are pretty good at their finals, marry up pretty well with the overall performance of their student, but they're awarding about 15% more points than that student would have gained if they had been assessed on some sort of quality core external assessment. That's a problem. Now, did they know that? No, they knew they were a top 100 high school in the United States, and that's all they needed to know. And we're good, so nothing needs to change. Now do they know something? Yes. And so we can go in there and have really concrete discussions about changing the course of instruction, raising standards, focusing on standards and the like. And overall, on the left, Butler High School, which is one of our struggling schools, it's not hard to see why they're struggling. And so we can go in and have really concrete discussions with them as well. And we can drill this down to teacher level. So this is Algebra 2. And what we're looking at here through our data that we're able to get through the digital system is what's the difference between what the teacher assessed the student's performance at and how we assessed it based on those common core aligned assessments administered through SchoolNet. So at Grissom, teacher number 1, there was no gap. Her assessments were right on the button with the external assessments. Over on the far right, teacher T3 at Lee High School had a huge gap. And so we can look across the system and say, if we were to do collaboration in some sort of a learning environment in the summer, who would we want to put in charge of that? Who do we want to have driving that? And this gives us a pretty clear indication of that. And then it also gives the principals very concrete information to have discussions about topics they may not actually be the subject matter expert in. So might have a history teacher who's now a principal, and we're talking about Algebra 2, and that history teacher, now principal, can have a really good discussion because he's got the data he needs. This is the same thing with regard to semester grades. And so you can see how that might be useful in driving instruction forward. And so when we began, just before we became a digital school system, these are the graduation rates for our high schools. Overall, the system was operating below the state goal. We were 66% of our kids were graduating within an on-time cohort. Butler, which I showed you a moment ago, about a third of their kids. And then at the far right, Grissom, about 90% of their kids. This is the picture for 2013. And so that's the kind of change you can see really quickly. And we expect to see that continue improving. So a lot going on in our school system. We did it relatively quickly. We planned in January of 2011 to undertake this conversion. The school board approved it in June of 2011. We purchased the computers in June of 2011. They were delivered in July. And in August, when school opened, we were a digital school system. The first 2 months were a little rocky, but by November, it was what we were doing, and this year it doesn't even come up anymore. So this is our second full year, and it's just what we do. And now it's just a matter of doing it well. So we do have the opportunities, if anybody's interested, to come to Huntsville and see how we did it. There's probably a lot of ways of going about this. We're happy to share all our strengths and weaknesses. We learned a lot along the way. We have tours, and the dates are there, and our website's there as well for your information. Thank you for your attention.